Is he still leaving? Okay.
As I talked to him this morning, he said,
Is he going to stay?
I know you don't. I know you don't. You're. How are you?
Jacob's the curator of the Reader's Gallery.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, fantastic. Yeah, great. And it's a space with even adventurous spirit. I hope so. I thought they were ever think about it.
I also think there's potential, I mean, to have an art space that's embedded this way
Yes.
inside of what's kind of an experiment intellectually, and then have the art intersect that. It's so nice.
Very nice. It's very nice. We need a couple of copies, but it's always nice. High expectations today. Oh, great. No, I'm gonna have to do this again. Yes, please. Thank you.
To our provost, Dan Meyer, and Marcus.
Thank you. Better when the great insight.
I'm supposed to say things.
Yes.
That's what I'm doing. Or you're not sure yet. You know Kristen? We're at the, I've only been at the, oh, okay. Yeah, so I'm not totally. Okay. Yeah, because we saw them another time. Yeah, like 10 years ago. Yeah, summer. Yeah. Yes,
Southwest Michigan. It is literally.
Are you okay? Do you need some water? Let's go. I'll go buy you a bottle of water. Were you at the ones? I remember.
You were born 7.
I'm Jonathan Lear, and I'm the Roman Family Director of the Neubauer Collegium for Culture and Society. I'd like to welcome you all. Many of you know about the Neubauer Collegium, but I think there's a fair number in the audience who do not. Let me just say that the Neubauer Collegium for Culture and Society sponsors collaborative research throughout humanistic inquiry. Our job is really to find and help people who want to come together who might not ordinarily be coming together. Some are scholars here and researchers, but we reach out to people around the world in all sorts of fields to join in these projects. We've been in existence, we're in our 4th year of existence, but it's actually it's about 1.5 years that we've been in this lovely building. We have 30 projects up and running now, each with 2, 3, sometimes 4 principal investigators, and then visiting fellows who come from around the world and stay for different periods of time. And although it's a very, we're a new, relatively new organization on campus, it's really very robust. We've had, I think, 54 projects that we've been sponsoring, and we've had 125 principal investigators in these projects. We've had over 40 global visiting fellows coming from, I think, 20 countries in this very, very short time. And I thought tonight for me is a very special evening because we, not only do we encourage collaboration among scholars to be working together on these fascinating new projects, we ourselves at the Neubauer Collegium are trying to be collaborative ourselves. And what you're going to see tonight is something that has emerged from a single one of these projects that I've mentioned. The Open Fields Project is a project that brings together, it actually begins, and this is where it always begins, with the kernel of an idea with the University of Chicago faculty. Justin Richland is an anthropologist right here in the audience who has been embedded with the Hopi Nation as an appellate court judge within the Hopi Nation. And he started having conversations with Alaka Wally. Alaka is a curator at the Field Museum down, as you all know where it is. Alaka, you're back there. Then those two came together to work with Jessica Stockholder, who's here a professor of art and the chair of the art department, to try and think in the most, you might say, firstly in the most narrow sense, but this is not at all narrow, what the future of a natural history museum any longer should be. And in particular, what is the heritage? What are we to do with 750,000 artifacts of native peoples that are in the basement, for the most part, of the Field Museum? And what is to be made, both in terms of what should the museum be going forward in ways that are culturally appropriate and valuable for the larger population, but also in ways that our native populations will find enlivening and stimulating to them. And to that effect, the Neubauer Collegium Open Fields Project, about a year ago, brought together into this very room a group that consisted of tribal elders from around the country, lawyers who have been, and also not just around the country, from Canada, First Peoples in Vancouver, great artists came, lawyers who have been fighting for Native peoples, Indigenous peoples, First Peoples rights in courts, and using artifacts as putting them into evidence. We brought them together with curators, collectors, anthropologists, people of all over, and also among the artists, some were native artists, some were non-native artists. Some of the native artists were trying to restore and revive and preserve ancient traditions of art making, but others, like you're going to hear tonight, want to take native identity and in aesthetics into new directions. We brought them all together for a few days to just talk with each other about museums, about art, about native art. And luckily for us back then, Anna Tsoularakis, who will be speaking to you in a moment, was one of the one of our visitors. And I became just thrilled with Anna's work, and you're going to be able to get to hear her and see her work today. But I think one of the other aspects of the Neubauer Collegium that we are trying to promote is that the visitors that would come here are not just the visitors of a moment, that people will come back, they'll visit us again. The projects that we're sponsoring, we will keep developing, and we will be working with the people over the years, and we'll just see where it goes. And so we then worked in a collaboration with the Field Museum. And today there was a fabulous opening this morning at the Field Museum of two young Native artists, Chris Papan and Rhonda Holybear. Their exhibits are going to be on display for, I think, the next 2 years. And I really encourage you to go to the Field Museum when you have a chance there. Fabulous, fabulous exhibitions. Chris Papan's work is, I wouldn't have been able to, I really couldn't have begun to imagine it before I saw it. It is a comment on the entire exhibition of Native American artifacts at the Field Museum. I expected to go see his work alongside the work of other artists, but it's a commentary on the entire hall of display. It's just astonishing to see. And Rhonda Holybear's beadwork it really defies description. So we at the Neubauer we work with with the projects. We continue on, and we're also working with other institutions within the city. And this is part of the reason this occasion is happening today is that it was on the same day as the openings at the Field Museum. Now, Anna, I'd like to also say that this wouldn't be possible if all the work that's going on here, and I do think this is it's tapped into a stunning creativity of the University of Chicago faculty and then the people they either meet or want to continue to talk with. None of this would have been possible without the generosity of Joe and Jeanette Neubauer, and I think it's a sign of the kind of generosity that they effortlessly display, is that they are very, very committed to people and helping develop the creativity of people in all sorts of different ways. I think this is just one instantiation of many, but I think it's also a sign of their commitment to this, that they're here with us today. They care about what we do here, and I'm just delighted to welcome you both and thank you. Now, Anna Tsoularakis, she'll speak for herself. I don't want to spend too much time here, but I just wanted to say, you take one look at that and you think something new is happening here. And I was stunned when I saw her work and heard her presentation a year ago with, I think it's Wordsworth who said that, part of the sign of a great artist is that he or she will create the audience, will create the aesthetic sensibility that will then appreciate the art. And I think this is really true of Anna's work, that there's an aesthetic sensibility here that is, I'll put it in my terms, taking responsibility for what the conception of Native aesthetics is to be. She is not leaving it as sort of a fixed category that we already know what Native art is, we already know what Native aesthetics is. She is really, I think, taking up the challenge of what Native aesthetics is going to be. And I think that for me aligns with a tremendous sense of creativity that is at the same time refusal to stick with not only fixed categories of Native aesthetics, but fixed narratives about how we are to think of Native peoples, about Native history, the relationship between what has been the dominant culture. There is not going to be, I think there's a resoluteness to there being a creative future. and a creative presence in Native American art. So let me just conclude by just reading out some of the facts, as it were, that Anna Tsoularitis is Navajo and Creek, and she's also Greek. And she was born in Lawrence, Kansas, and raised in Taos, New Mexico. She received her BA in Native American Studies and Studio Art from Dartmouth College, her MFA from Yale University. In fact, Jessica Stockholder is one of her former teachers, and she's the recipient of many awards and residencies, and she's had solo exhibitions at the Flashpoint Gallery in Washington, the American Indian Community Gallery in New York, the Navajo Nation Museum in Window Rock, Arizona, and Downtown Contemporary Arts Center in Albuquerque. And her work has been included, in galleries really around the country and in Canada. So with that brief introduction, let me introduce Anna Tsoularitis, who will explain, sort of give a presentation about her work in general, and then it will be followed by a discussion of the show that we're about to see today. Anna, thank you so much for being with us.
First of all, I just wanted to thank all of you for being here and to give a special thank you to everyone involved in the Open Fields Project and the Neubauer Collegium, and of course the generosity of the Neubauer family. Thank you very much. I guess in this kind of presentation, it's a shortened presentation of what I gave last year, kind of like a greatest hits, I guess. Just to give you a brief history of the work I've done, mainly since college. This is an image from home, from Standing Rock, New Mexico, where my family's from. But we can kind of start here. So throughout my life, I've been making art. My father's an artist. My grandfather was an artist. Many artists in my family that do a lot of traditional work, such as jewelry, beadwork, leather work, different things like that. And so it's always been just kind of my life to be an artist. But it really was at college where I was learning about more conceptual work, really learning about how the trajectories of Latin American art and African American art had kind of taken off with different technology, different mediums. And so I was really interested in exploring that and figuring out where those trajectories would be for Native American art and who was doing that and how far were they pushing it. And so this was, I think, the first sculpture I made, maybe the second sculpture I'd ever made while I was at college, and it's a full body cast. And it was me really just kind of learning a new way of working and then trying to figure out what that meant, because before, I had been exposed to Native work that had been displayed either in an art market or in a museum where it was very precious. And so my dad, like I said, makes jewelry, so it's all about the preciousness. And so how could I work against that, with that, and really kind of change things and work off of it, on the floor directly, and really thinking about those things. And so this is a performance piece I did. It's called Travwall. Kind of blew my mind when I learned about performance art in undergrad. And so this is a piece that I did in Hanover, New Hampshire. And so this was also my first performance piece, and you can kind of see I have my actual license plate from my car on there, because I was nervous that I might get a ticket or something. So, and I like the idea of kind of evoking a sense of humor in the work as well. I feel like that with a lot of Native work, it tends to be very stoic, very kind of serious, which is great, and that's totally fine. But I think really trying to kind of show that we're multidimensional people. And then continuing into graduate school, I was, again, exploring different ideas of Native identity. What did it mean to be a Native on the East Coast in a more urban environment? I had come from high school in Taos, New Mexico, and even Dartmouth is a very rural area in New Hampshire. And so kind of coming to a bigger city in New Haven, which is near New York, and so thinking about what it meant to be kind of a Native in an isolated kind of environment in terms of identity. In terms of knowledge that people had of who you were and what your background was. And so this is kind of the first time I started realizing that I wanted to source the experiences of other Natives. And so these are all Polaroids of that I took of Native students up at Dartmouth. And I was thinking a lot about how kind of the facts that were known about them and how that was presented, but also the idea of what they were to themselves, like their own kind of mythic persona. And so a lot of people, connected that to their major, but then you had other people who, their field was boozer baller. And so kind of really trying to just kind of shake up what definitions of identity were. The number up in the corner is actually their certificate jury of Indian blood number, so that's a real number that we're all required by law to have, by federal law, in order to have access to our land, to health services and things like that. So you can see that everyone can. So I did this again several times, different iterations of different communities. I did it in New York, in New Hampshire, in Maine. Went home, and this is one that I did with my family for an exhibition in Albuquerque, so it's set up like a family tree. Let's see, and then there's another close-up there. And so you kind of get a sense, too, of the way that numbers are kind of set up by tribe. And during this time, it was interesting to meet natives who weren't documented necessarily as tribal members. And so they knew all the rest of the information, but they actually didn't have a number. And so dealing with that and like putting in different things, I think somebody we put in their number is 876-5309. And so, just kind of getting people to, that are coming and looking at this, it's very serious, but how can we kind of mess with that? And it really got me thinking about interactions of the audience and kind of the expectations that the gallery sets for Native artists. And those how can I kind of play with those as well? One of the first times I showed this was in New Haven at the gallery. I think it was just kind of maybe a first year show or something like that. And somebody came up and asked me if that was real and if they could see my number. And I said, well, actually, I don't really feel comfortable showing it to people. and it just blew their mind that I had this tattooed on me. And so it was, again, trying to play with that, the narrative that is kind of expected of us in an institution. And it also made me really question like those expectations in reference to my classmates. Why was somebody able to do, male genitalia out of socks and plaster, but I had to be relegated to being the educator of something, so. So this is another performance piece, or kind of a performance piece that was built out of a sculpture. And so this is a big rocket ship. It's about 12 feet tall, and it's actually working. So you can go into it and kind of explain the other kind of parts of it. So when I presented this piece, I actually read a short story that went along with it, and then kind of showed everyone how the rocket ship worked. So I'm going to read you the paragraph really quick. When the natural resources of Earth start becoming scarce, many people will look towards the option of leaving this planet in hope of finding another planet that will sustain life. While most people will be in the fancy, sophisticated NASA-type space shuttles, there will be people such as Indians who cannot afford such luxury and will have to build their own ships. These less complicated rocket ships will not be able to take off on their own and will have chains that hook onto the larger rocket ships. But one thing each of those shoddy rocket ships will have is an escape hatch in the floor. As all of the larger spaceships begin their countdown to take off, all the Indians will be slipping out of their escape hatches. The Indians will be putting their feet on the ground while everyone else is on their way out of here. And so again, trying to deal with some serious topics and like the government, to government relationship, but in a different way, kind of a more unique way. And this is the interior. It had actually Southwest designs on the inside. You can see the decor. I experimented with more video. Yale was really where I started pursuing a bit more video. This is these are 9 stills from a 5-minute video that was called Navigation, where I kind of used my stereotypical Indian instincts to guide myself from point A to point B, which was about a quarter mile, and I made it successfully. And so kind of covered my eyes, somebody spun me around, so I was just going off of my Indian senses there. And this is a piece that I did while I was at Skowhegan, in Skowhegan, Maine, at a residency for 8 weeks. So I'm going to show you part of this video. It's called Let's Dance. And it's a 15-minute long video where I danced their 30-second kind of increments, and I'll kind of skip around to show you through it. But I'm doing 30 different dances over the span of 30 days with different people. And they're teaching me the dance. So I'd never, done these dances before for the most part, and I don't do them very well usually.
I just wanna dance with you. I wanna dance with you. To the rock and roll, here you find the young and old, twisting the night away, yeah, twisting.
Like the Dolomite, done with God and God creation.
Put your right hip in, you put your right hip out, you put your right hip in, and you shake it all about. You
Paris White is just got a little proof. Right up to your face and diss you. Everyone saw me on the left.
So this is a Bulgarian dance. From there, these are, so this is probably about a couple of years later. These are, so I was working a lot in video at the time, documenting different things, but I was really interested in creating kind of a futuristic narrative. I was living in Albuquerque at the time, and really trying to think about what it meant to be kind of a native in Albuquerque, because it has a much larger native population, but it's a very racist town if you're a native person. You tend to get, it's hard to rent a place, it's hard to find people that will help you out in different ways if you, like dog walking and such, because they don't want to have native clients. And so it was a difficult place because you kind of think, I'm going home and it's going to be fantastic. And then you're that much more kind of conscious of what you're going back to. And so it was a really interesting experience. And so kind of what came out of that was this idea of thinking of these futuristic myths. And so I did a suite of about 8 different performances and documented them with photography. And so this is called Legend 1. And so they're all done with duct tape directly on my skin. And these are large digital prints. And also while I was living in Albuquerque, I did probably the only paintings I've ever done in my life. I did about 24 of these. These are about 12 inches by 12 inches, and these are 3 of them set up. So I was really interested in thinking about minimalist design and iconography and how that related to face paint, like Native American face paint. If you go to powwows, you'll see people painted up, and it's really, you go to the powwow and you're always wondering what people's face, how it'll be painted, the different dancers, and how, they'll stay close to one design, but they might change it up for Saturday, Saturday night when everybody's blitzed up, and how the adornment will change, over time and by family members and by tribe. And so I wanted to document that somehow, because that is a very, cool art form that people don't really think about, because it really is minimalist painting done by natives. And so, but I didn't feel that it was right for me to necessarily take that directly from people that I just photographed at a powwow or at different dances, and because those are very personal and usually, very spiritual. And so I decided to pull them from Hollywood movies. And so these are all from Dances with Wolves. And so they're all named after the different characters. Like, I think this is like Pawnee 1, Pawnee 2, and Wind in His Hair. And so if you can imagine that being like where their faces, like the black line would be where the eyes were, and kind of the opening right here in the white would be where his mouth is. And so this was one, so I did, I think, a dozen of these from different Native characters in the movie. And then this is Last of the Mohicans. And you can see it's a transition to the East Coast. So, and they're all done in gouache. And again, like literally the only paintings I've ever done in my life. Okay. And then when we lived in New York for a bit, I did, you know, I was back again being to like the isolated native in a big city. You can tell we moved back and forth across the country a lot. And so I really wanted to get back into these kind of communal projects that I had been doing before with the Polaroids and kind of a couple of other things that I had done, you know, when we were moving around. And so this is at Socrates Sculpture Park in Long Island City in New York. And what I did was I was thinking about the history of Manhattan Island. I think you've probably heard about it when you were in elementary school, how Manhattan was bought for $24 from the Lenape Indians by the Dutch, and basically they got very screwed over. And so what I did was I put a call out to over email, because social media wasn't really huge back, you know, in the mid-2000s yet. For Native peoples. And so I put a call out on email asking people who wanted to participate. And so what I did was I sent people $24 in cash and asked them to buy something for me and to send it to me, or I'd go around and pick it up. And so it was an amazing project, and it turned up like everything from stuffed animals to gay porn to like a fishing reel. And then this participant, it says I donated the entire amount to Project Find, which is located on the corner of 42nd and 9th Avenues. It's a homeless service organization. So I created these structures that are reminiscent of like burial structures or offerings structures kind of from the Northern Plains. And so, and put all of those things on there. And the nice thing, or the not nice thing that kind of happened throughout this, because it's an outdoor area, is that a lot of them got ripped off and broken. And so I have images of like where like somebody gave me some books, like the books are ripped in half, and it was just perfect for the entire narrative that I was kind of talking about and referring to. So this is a video project that I did. I lived in London for a bit, and it was commissioned for a show dealing with the 400th, is that right? Of the discovery of the Hudson River, or the exploration of the Hudson River. And so this is one video, part of the video was shot in New York on the Hudson, and the other was on the Thames in London. And so in this, there are 3 different audio tracks going on, or 4 different audio tracks going on of like the different tour boats, but also me talking as myself, kind of exploring these places, and then me kind of taking over the identity of Henry Hudson. And so I think they have this. So I'll just kind of...
I was born in Westfield, in London, and then
500 years. It was shut down about 20 years ago and moved further downstream.
So it's about 3 minutes long.
The only fish you'll see today are on the roof. They're golden
my earliest memories until working alongside my memories were.
I think the audio, you'll kind of sense some connections over there with that piece. This is a project that I did a few years back in DC. It's called Aesthetically Speaking. And so it's a group of about 6 images that I did with all Native women that live in the DC area. And then more recently, so this is from 2012, I've gone back to this idea of really trying to bring communities together, Native communities. And so this was a piece that was installed at the Museum of Contemporary Native Art in Santa Fe. And it was up there for about 6 months, and so it's in their big courtyard in the back. And so it's this structure of found wood from the Navajo Reservation, from where my family's from, and then all of the signage that has been customized. So what I did was I sent I always call it monkey survey, Survey Monkey, out to Navajos that I knew and had people forward it. And it was talking about the idea of multiple worlds and Navajo spirituality. And if we thought that we were close, I think this was right after the last election. It was right around that time. And so kind of asking, are we close to the end of the world? Is this the last world? Do you think there's another world? What do you think those worlds look like? And so from the responses I received, I created signs out of that text. And so that's what all of these kind of are dealing with. And so if you start from the beginning, they're very kind of more negative, and as you get closer to the center, they become a little bit more, the tone kind of changes. And this was the center. There was kind of it was dug out and it looked like a hatch of some sort, but it was hard to tell like if it was going to open, like if it was an opening or a closing. This is another one of them. This is another show that I did there a couple of years later at the MOCNA in Santa Fe. And so it's a 3-channel digital video installation, and it's a narrative of the lives of my grandmother, myself, and my daughter, who was my only daughter at the time. I have 2 now, and a son. And so just kind of talking about our lives in reference to kind of the linear qualities that happen out in the landscape of New Mexico with coal lines that go, that are in canyons. And so all of the video is kind of like this cropped stuff. But it was taken, I went around and traveled all over the country, and I was actually even in Europe shooting for this, kind of gathering footage for about 2 years of all the different places I had lived and where my grandmother had lived. And luckily my daughter hadn't visited that many places yet. So that's where that comes from. So again, going back to this idea of pulling from the local community and trying to give a platform to different Native voices, this was a solo exhibition I had in DC a couple of years ago. And using Survey Monkey again, it was about the DC experience as a Native American, and so asking people how they felt about living there, and what were their responses, what were incidents that had happened to them, and so intertwined with the text are these kind of bundles that were of wood that were gathered from Rock Creek Park, which is the park that splits DC kind of in half in some ways. And so that's where that's all pulled from. And it was funny that it showed up in the sports section, if anyone can see why. There was one little line about the Redskins, and it showed up as, our next anti-Redskins exhibition, which happened today with the Field Museum. The Chicago Tribune came out with an article around 3:30 today saying that there were Field Museum artists that were anti-Chief Wahoo. So it wasn't about the art again. It wasn't about, anything that they'd worked on to build for it. It was about, there were natives that don't like this sports mascot. So let's just bring it all back. And so again, the narrative kind of shifts as you go around the room, from being kind of more negative to more positive, ambivalent to becoming a little bit more positive. And I did this again up at Dartmouth College with all kind of the Native community, both current students, faculty, and alums. Another kind of survey and kind of pulling from the text. And this is a more recent piece. This is, it was a piece that for a show in Arlington, Virginia at a space. And the show was kind of about highlighting what Arlington meant kind of as a city, as a spot of kind of for the military, but also for, its relationship to DC. And so for the exhibition, I call this Portrait of a Kiowa Woman. I met a woman whose name is Cinda Hughes, and she's disabled in a wheelchair. And she's Kiowa from Oklahoma, but has been working in DC for about 20 years, 15, 20 years. And so basically this is a documentation kind of her daily life, but also went to Anadarko, Oklahoma, where her family's from, and used part of the footage from there as well. And it was really exciting because she is a phenomenal woman. She was, Miss Wheelchair America, which is a huge thing. And it was funny how she was like, I'm going to do this, when she was, I think 38, and people thought she was too old, and she became Miss Wheelchair America when she was 40, and just really wanted to kind of promote like the identity of disabled Native women and kind of heighten that voice. And so I was really excited to this is the first time I really dug deep with another person to kind of really hear and learn about their story in more depth. So for me, it was a really important piece in that way. And that's it. Thank you.
So now we're going to have we've had this lovely discussion Anna's presented the sort of trajectory of her work. We're going to have a relatively brief discussion of the opening today in Anna's art. And so Anna will be one of the discussants, and Jessica Stockholder, who's as I said, the chair of the art department here at the University of Chicago and a former teacher of Anna's, and Jacob Proctor is a curator here at the Neubauer Collegium, and the three of them, and I'll moderate, we'll have a discussion about today's show, which is called She Made for Her. So why not come on up, please, and yeah, I think that would be great, and I'll go down with you.
Is this working? So thank you all for coming. And I guess I'll just start off, maybe some of you have probably had an opportunity to see the show, see and hear the show that is up here, and some of you maybe haven't had that chance yet. But maybe, Anna, do you want to just describe a little bit what the show here consists of?
So there are three large sculptures that you kind of see when you go in, and then there's an audio installation that's made up of 4 tracks that's kind of you can hear throughout the gallery. All of the sculptures are made from the IKEA as-is section. I don't know if you guys are aware of that, or either pulled from the dumpsters in the back of IKEA. So I was very good about being true, for better or worse, to using solely IKEA objects, except for like the screws and whatnot. But yeah, and then the audio is pulled from about 15 Native women. Again, I sent a call. My friends are probably tired of me. I sent a call out to all the Native women that I put on Facebook and got responses to the pieces. And basically, they are their remarks about what they're seeing, and kind of as though they're here in the gallery with us.
Could you explain what the as-is section is?
Yeah. So the as-is section is kind of the returned pieces at IKEA, or the broken pieces. Maybe they're from floor models, but they're definitely not in pristine condition. Remnant section.
And the show came, and the relationship between the sculpture and the audio has a kind of backstory to that as well, which is based on a visit that you made to NMAI, right, to the National Museum of American Indian.
So when we were doing, it kind of started like just the beginning thinkings of it were when we were here last year for the Open Fields Project. I met for the first time Robert Davidson, who's an amazing traditional totem pole carver.
He'll make paintings and
Yeah.
prints too. Yeah.
And so,
And jewelry also.
and so it was really, fun to kind of hear about kind of the stories that kind of go into the object, something that, obviously I'm aware of as a Native person, but again, just to kind of be reminded of that in a very kind of straight way. And so I think it was actually before I came to that Opens Fields, I was at the National Museum of American Indian with my family. And we were walking through an exhibit, and I saw a woman who was Native, leading a group of non-natives. And because I'm familiar with the museum, I knew that she didn't work there. And she was leading this tour group through talking about different objects. And then I realized that she really didn't have any idea what she was talking about. And she was pointing specifically to one piece, and she said, and that's a breastplate. And I was thinking, well, that's not. That's a plains backrest. And so the group started moving away, and it was there was a kind of straggler, and I went up to this person and I said, well, Dina, actually that's not a breastplate, it's a backrest. And they looked at me and they said, what are you talking? My friend is Native American, and she knows what everything in this museum is, and just seemed very angry at the thought that I would second guess this person. And so it really made me start thinking about these kind of identities that are formed a lot in urban areas that are kind of constructed for the interactions with non-natives, and what is that coming out of, and then where is that going, and how does that hurt or not even, or work towards building a sense of Native community or Native people. So there were a lot of different layers that kind of came out of this. And so I decided that I wanted, and in relationship to how that, the oral histories that Robert was talking about with his objects, I decided that I wanted to create personal objects and give narratives to those objects. And so that was where a lot of this kind of came out of.
So that meaning that you made new artifacts and then you sourced sort of responses, kind of ad hoc responses to those objects from people who didn't actually necessarily know much of anything about contemporary art, for example, or sculpture.
No, these are from environmentalists, attorneys, stay-at-home moms. So I don't think any of them are artists actually that responded.
I enjoy in the show the sound is a kind of murmur, and when I'm in the space, I pick up little bits and pieces of things, and I find that hearing the process that led to gathering those thoughts, and I did have the privilege to hear a few of them on my computer separately. But I can't in that space really concentrate on any single voice, or it's difficult to. And they all there's a murmur, and it kind of rises and falls. And I really like the way that group of voices becomes equivalent to the audience that IKEA is marketing towards. It becomes a kind of a community with a particular aesthetic, even in the voices. They're all women, and I kind of wonder why if your audience is women, if the work is kind of directed towards women, if that's part of why the women are always the subject. But there's a closedness, the work is directed towards Native communities in terms of its subject and history, but there's also a really big openness at the same time, and I really appreciate that in the work.
I think it was really important to me to have Native women voices, because when I started thinking about this woman who, for better or for worse, was educating people, I was interested in, when I see another Native woman, I want to back her up. I want to do something for her. I want to help, lend a hand. And so I decided that this would be kind of like our sisterhood bonding experience together, was, me connecting to this woman and bringing all these Native women with me as her backup gang. And, so that's why I think it was really important, because kind of creating this strange sense of sisterhood, of community, in something that is so not was really important.
I also really like the work that you showed, aesthetically speaking. And when we were at the Field Museum today, I was thinking about how those artifacts were made without an alphabet or a written language at anyone's disposal. So the effort to tell stories was in part related to that need. And so now we do have an alphabet, you know, we all share one, and yet there's still a need to tell stories in this other way, making things and through the history of skill and how materials and skills are embedded in the cultures, various cultures. And I wondered if you had thoughts about that, about for me that question comes up in relationship to this work, the degree of opacity that's attached to the narrative, how much it's available to an audience and how much it isn't, and imagining that when people didn't have access to alphabet, that the narratives were more localized in terms of who they were directed to. There wasn't the same capacity for everybody to understand the symbols.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of wondering how you think about that in your work.
Well, I think that it's just with kind of like the modernization of culture and of natives integrating, and I don't want to say assimilation because it's not assimilation, but really learning to utilize different languages, that it is becoming universal in the sense that when I say something, you're able to understand it if I use IKEA as my alphabet. And I think that was one thing that got me thinking too, is that, you know, if you're a native artist, you know, some people would say, wait, oh, you make things out of wood. You know, usually when I tell people I'm a sculptor, they'll be like, oh, you make pottery? You know, I mean, that's been happening literally for 20 years since I kind of became an artist. And so, not that anything's wrong with pottery, but why is it always pottery? And so, I think for me, like, I was thinking about that, and, you know, as a person living in DC, what's that accessible medium that I should be, that I think I could be using? And I do like all of the different levels that IKEA kind of brings on its own, and kind of all of those dialogues that happen when you present something made from IKEA. And so, and like, you know, all the way to like the do-it-yourself, like IKEA hacks. And I think that even within the audio, and it was interesting because if you actually listen, there's some native languages being spoken as well. So some of the audio was sent in native languages, and so I think there's things that are, you know, very accessible, like somebody saying that it looked like a dish rack, and you know, all the way to somebody speaking in Crow, which is like a beautiful language, but completely unintelligible to a non-Crow person. So, and I do like that there are some things that, you know, only a couple people here are gonna get.
In the same way that when you go to IKEA, there's a relatively small portion of the audience that knows what the historical antecedent on which the IKEA knockoff is kind of based, you know, like the ubiquitous like IKEA stool, and you know, how many people are going to know that that's basically an imitation of an Alto stool, like versus just experiencing it kind of cold. I mean, was there a sort of a politics to choosing the as is section, in any, like, in the sense of that it is the kind of the leftovers, the kind of the remainders, the damaged goods, as it were, that are still barely functional?
I definitely think so. Like, I actually, when I was deciding that I wanted to use IKEA wood, I started out at Craigslist, and I was thinking about that, and I realized that if I was going to use IKEA, I definitely wanted it to be as is, because it brought me back to the piece that I had done before, the Legend series with duct tape. It being kind of like, you know, so many different dimensions of duct tape, and kind of where that goes from being kind of, if you know what it is and you use it a lot, you're probably not very wealthy, all the way to something that's super like futuristic. And so kind of all these different connotations that are layered within that medium. And so that's really what brought me to the as is section, was that part of it. But also, you know, the idea of paying for something that was brand new, and as natives, we tend to, you know, use the parts that nobody else wants. And so, you know, last weekend I was in Arizona helping butcher sheep, and most, you know, we were there actually with a lot of non-natives, and having the entrails, and people are like, oh, we just throw those away, and, you know, we actually make a sausage out of it, sort of, with the fat. It's called itchji. And so that was, like, just thinking about how we source every bit that we can, and you always hear these stories in, like, you know, history class when you're in elementary school or, you know, junior high, and so that's why a lot of that is layered within that, I think.
I have a question. I don't know, it's hardly, I don't even think it's quite a question, but I'd like you to, if you could say something about humor. And I find your work very funny and very poignant, but I also think of, you know, I feel that runs through native life, humor. And I'm just curious what you...
I think it's so insanely important to my work, to always have something that kind of tinges it on being not too serious. I think, you know, when you're a Native community, probably a lot of communities, it's kind of like people are like, don't act too good, don't be too much that way, or, you know, or it's not good for you, you know. And so in Native ways, you know, it's not the good way to be like that. And so always kind of thinking about that in the back of my mind. And so even when I was creating this work, like, even though it is IKEA as is, it was very serious to me, and I, you know, already talked about Jessica with, you know, these abstract sculptures and how to lighten that up. And I knew that, you know, using either audio or text would help me kind of inform those pieces more. But I think for me, you know, because this is a relationship that I wanted to create with this woman at the NMAI who was talking to the group there. But it's also at the same time, you know, when I was there in the space with her, I was thinking, what the hell is she doing? You know, so how do I convey that? And so in the title, that's where the title she made for her, the first letter of each word is SMFH. I don't know if any of you guys know what that means. Ask somebody that does, or Google that. And so for me, that's like at the base as well of the show, is that it's built on that.
We have time for some questions, if you'd like, from the audience. Yes, please, sir.
Native American history is so rich in its contribution to both the aesthetic for art and artifact. And you don't come from nowhere. This is an important background for you. Two questions. How do you feel about the iconizing of this in institutions and in collections, number one? And number two, how does that history and background influence the statement that you have today, given this wealthy background?
I mean, I think that directly informs my practice and my whole intention of creating art, because my dad, like I said, is a jeweler. And so from the very beginning, you know, memories of me sitting with him in his studio and work, you know, and then going with him to art markets and stuff, him having to make work that had to be sold, you know, to support our family, but also had to be sold to what collectors thought of or deemed as Native American art. And so, and he was never able, is still not able to deviate from that. And so it became imperative to me as an artist to never rely solely on that. And because I think that unfortunately, you know, in the past 50 years, I feel like as Native peoples, we've lost some artistic boldness to go in different directions. You know, we've been pulling from the same well of iconography for the past 40 years because that's what people want to see. They want to see a buffalo in the middle of an Avex painting, you know? Where is it, you know? And so that is something that I so want to work against, and I think that's why in any sort of imagery that I'm creating, I want to be, you know, severely aware of what images I am creating and what connections they have to the iconography collected that's being sold, that's being, you know, emblazoned on posters or calendars or postcards, and work against that in some ways. You know, but it's funny because, you know, I do work like this, but the entire philosophy of where it all comes from is completely traditional. And it's solidly based in Native ways of thinking. You know, when I think I was probably around 15, and I was reading an article somewhere, it was an interview with an elder, and this elder was in a sweat lodge with a young boy, and the elder was telling the boy, you know, you need to make a song up, because when you're in sweat, like everyone takes a turn singing a song. And he said, you know, he's like, no, I can't do that. That's you sing the song. And the elder told the boy, he said, if you don't make a song, our culture will die. If you don't take hold and begin to do that, because I think in a lot of ways, somehow we kind of just refrain from being as bold as we used to be. And I think, that's definitely changing, and it's resurging, I think, in the, 2000s, but I think there was kind of a stagnant part for a while, and I think that's why it was so important for me to kind of go the way that I'm going.
And how do you feel about the iconization of the collection being shown in white man's institutions?
I find it extreme. As lovely as the Field Museum is, and that it has such resources of works that are very informative and educational. It's really problematic to me that it's shown next to dinosaurs. And I think, when those, even to the name of the National Museum of American Indian, it's not called that because we call ourselves American Indian. It's called that because the collection of George Gustav Hyde that donated all of that to the Smithsonian said that his collection had to be called, an American Indian collection. So it wasn't up to Native. So even that sits on the National Mall is defined by, white collectors.
But the Art Institute of Chicago's middle name is Art, is a very prominent American Indian contribution. How do you feel about it in that venue?
I have a feeling, I don't know much about the Art Institute, but I wonder what the collector's intentions are by the work they do collect. Is it contemporary Native art? Is it contemporary Native art in the sense that it has to have traditional Native iconography? I know a couple of artists that are in that collection, and they still play into that idea of what a Native artist should be.
Yeah. Anna, thank you so much again for being here with us. When you were here last year, you said something that was so poignant, and I've heard elsewhere. You spoke of your ambivalent feelings about always having to, as a Native woman and as a Native artist, about having to be an educator. Now, why is it that you get put in this position of having to teach all the time? At the same time, you are a conceptual artist, and also you're coming from Navajo traditions, which, if I understand, aesthetics and ethics go hand in hand, the beauty way, it's all of a piece. So I'm curious how you grapple with the two sides of this, that is, the wanting to escape, having to always be an educator, and then also moving in media and moving in traditions and moving in modalities that always have this element. And how does that speak in this piece, in your show here?
I think, in the past 3 weeks in DC, I've given 3 lectures about Native mascots. And, I have 2 more that are coming up at different schools. And it sucks being in that position. But I also know if I don't do it, who else will? And so I think within the art realm, there are definitely points where I feel like the education is necessary, but I'm a lot less consistent with that. And I like being more playful with that, because I've definitely done shows where I'm utilizing that, the expectation that the audience has coming in, and I'm, kind of putting that back on myself and, turning that over and tearing that apart. And so I would say that in some ways I'm, all about being the educator because I know it's necessary, but at the same time, I don't think I need to be, there's no reason that I should have to be consistent in that within my art.
Last question.
All right, Anna, thank you very much. it's very fascinating listening to you. I really don't think I understand a lot of that, but I think there are a few hours more for me and days for me to try and grapple and understand. Something that I found interesting when you were responding to, I don't know which question it was, about having as a resource traditional philosophy. It resonated with me. I come from Ghana, and I work in a tradition of African philosophy. We're also trying to do the same thing, So I'm just thinking that here I find you trying to symbolize responding to an existential predicament, which is what I think the tradition from which I'm working on. So someone is interpreting you, misrepresenting you, and there's got to be a response to that. And you do that with symbols. We try to do that with conceptualizing it. So ultimately, it's a matter of self-representation. So it is education, right? But here I find you saying, well, maybe I don't see myself as an educator. I'm trying to just extend the representations that are not me, but it is education. And how can you just clarify how for you it is not ultimately educative, your work?
I think that, I'm a contradictory person, and that's okay. And I'm fully okay with contradicting myself, because if I was a white male artist, would I be questioned for that? And that is where kind of I would say that's one of the things I learned, coming out of graduate school, is that I can be a complex person that can change my mind like that. And that's okay. I'm okay with that, and you all need to be okay with that as well.
I think I'd also like to add, I think that art objects, like the ones in the other room, are there to be experienced, and they convey an experience and feeling and thoughts that are not the same as not didactic. They're not didactic objects. They're there to create experience for people to dwell with the cares that you have. So that's very different than standing up here describing them. They exist and function over there in a different way.
It's time for us to thank Anna Soulardi. Welcome you all to this opening of the exhibition and to a reception that's happening right outside. Thank you very much for coming.
I'll be right out here.
It's just different. I know that that's but I think it would be great to come back to that. Wasn't it there?
Yeah.
Hi, Bridget.
Or the login to Easy, right?
Like objects, like something.